articles, reading books, but his presentation this morning, so looking forward to as he rounds us off and talks about extending the grazing season.
It's the one we didn't do this morning? You betcha. Before I get too far underway, because I'll forget at the end of this session, I've already sold out of the quality pasture book. Didn't realize it'd be quite so popular. And so what I've been doing, if anybody wants that book, I could say, oh, just go to our website and order it. If you want to pay for it today, we will ship it to you, with no postage on it, just because it's my mistake for not bringing enough books. Okay, so following up, this morning I told you that you shouldn't be making hay and all that. Well, there's got to be an alternative to eating in the wintertime. And so we're going to talk now about if you decide to kick the hay habit and sell all of your haying equipment, because remember Dr. Halich said this morning that if you keep your equipment and only make half as much hay, you've just doubled the overhead cost on every ton of hay that you made. And so we're going to talk about alternatives. And I start from this standpoint. And if you're raising sheep, plug in U for a cow here. It'll come out about the same. But I look at every animal on the farm or ranch as being an employee. And so if you've got 100 cows, you've got a business with 100 employees. And if you had a business in town with 100 employees, you would probably have written out something that we used to call position descriptions. In this kinder, gentler world of business today, we call them target achievement areas. But so what is it? What is the cow's job? What should go into the position description? And so when we do workshops, you would actually we'd take 5 minutes and you'd start writing the position description for the cow. So I'm just going to put in what I consider to be a cow's job. Rustle her own grub. Find the best bite of feed that she can. Deliver a live calf every 12 months. Bring a healthy calf to the weaning pen. Stay healthy herself without a lot of fuss. What did Dr. Gordon Jones say the most important genetic trait was? Environmental adaptation. I concur 100% with that. If your animals are not adapted to your environment, all of these other traits become moot because she's not going to work anyway. And that staying healthy within your environment is part of that context. And then I have some other tasks here. Mow weeds, fertilize pastures, plant seeds, till ground. These are all jobs that we can have a cow do if we are managing her effectively to accomplish that. And one of the most important ones of all, come to work every day with a positive attitude. All right. So to me, that's the job of a cow. It is not my job to carry feed to her. It's not my job to pick through that pasture and find the perfect bite of feed. She needs to do that. I don't babysit cows. If you have to go out in the calving season more than once a day, and especially if you're going to do it at night, there is something wrong with your cows and your choice of bulls. Okay, period. You shouldn't have to do those things. That's a cow's job, is to have a baby, get it up and get it going. We also have the opportunity of when that baby is going to be born, and we'll come back to that later. So if we look at these things being a cow's job, this is what we're going to plan around. So if it's not our job to carry feed to her and nursemaid to her, what is our job as the manager? Right, there's the first one. We create a working environment where your employees can thrive. When Jimmy Henning was an administrator, I would hope that is one of the things that he strove to do. everybody who has a business that you're the manager of, this is your task. Set up the working environment where your cow can be the very best cow that she can be. We need to maintain ranch infrastructure. I've never seen a cow run through a fence, knock it down, put it back up. There are certain things that we have to do. We have to keep the water running. We have to keep the fences up. Working facilities functional. Market ranch products. Several people I've talked to have said they're in the grass-fed beef business. They are direct marketing. Greg talked about that. And yeah, that's a job for the manager. The cows aren't going to sell themselves as hamburger or steaks. You've got to do that selling process. So that's a very important part of our job, is marketing those products. And then plan, replan, and adapt. You do not want to let cows make business decisions. None of them are qualified to do it. They know everything there is to be about being a cow, and that's their job. But everything else for planning, things like year-round grazing, that's our job. And when we're talking about year-round grazing, you don't go to a workshop in September and come away real excited and say, man, I'm going to graze my cows all winter this year. The process starts before the first blade of grass turns green in the spring. You're already figuring out how many stock you're going to have, where they're going to be, when they're going to be, when are you going to sell stuff, when are you going to buy stuff. And it's a well thought out, well planned process to get to that point. First thing you need to know is, what do you have to work with? What is your seasonal forage supply? And there's been several people who have talked about, basically that topic. When is the fescue there? Why did you plant that warm season grass? Where do annuals fit into this program? And so we have these different choices. And as it's been said several times already today, through this swath of the country where most of you live, that predominant base pasture is tall fescue. And we have to put the adjectives on it, because tall fescue under a center pivot in Idaho is a very different plant than endophyte infected tall fescue growing in this hot, humid country. But that's the foundation that most of you are working with. I really liked what Will talked about, of putting in those native warm season grasses. I actually, early on in my career at Missouri, I was pretty skeptical about native warm season grasses. But then on our farm, we had some native remnant prairie, and we started managing it effectively. And working with Missouri Department of Conservation, we did some research trials with native warm season grasses. And lo and behold, they actually work. They can be established. They provide feed as an alternative to the fescue in the summertime, something that's non-toxic that animals can actually perform on. So they're valuable. And then we can throw the annuals in there, whether we're talking about cool season annuals used over the winter months or warm season annuals to give us high amount of high quality feed in the summer. There's a place for all of those things. The more of those that you can work into your forage base, the greater opportunity you have to have something of appropriate quality more days of the year. So we're all about knowing what your forage supply is, identifying your weak points, and then filling in those weak points. Something that I do every 2 weeks, I go across all my pastures and I assess how much feed do I have. How do I do it? Nothing more than the trained eye. If you do daily controlled grazing and you visually estimate how much feed you think is there, and I work in animal unit days per acre, I say, okay, there's 53 AUDs per acre out there. I know how many animal units are in the herd. I set up my temporary fences based on my guess that was 52 AUDs per acre. If I come back tomorrow and it's that short, I was wrong and I adjust. I come back tomorrow and it's still that tall, I was wrong and I adjust. And if you do that 30 days in a row, your eye will statistically be as accurate as any tool we use in research to measure forage yield. That's all it takes. I did run an analysis of 7 years of my visual estimates to what the actual grazing response was. My standard error was 4%. That's pretty good. Considering research, we're usually 10, 12% or worse. So we do an inventory every 2 weeks, so we know what we have in front of us, what's regrowing behind us. All right, we come to the end of the growing season, and the last inventory of the growing season tells us what we have to work with over our dormant season. All right, so when I was in Missouri, and it was 1980, when I left UK and went to Missouri, the weather was different. It did get cold, it did freeze, and there was a bona fide dormant season where nothing grew. As the years went by, that kind of faded away, and stuff grew all winter. I think in Kentucky, for the most part, most winters, there is something growing most days of the year. It might be, just a winter annual forage. It might be the tall fescue. The latter years that I was in Missouri, rarely did we see fescue just freeze off completely brown and have no trace of green in it. It seems that there's a lot more green over winters now. But that last inventory of the year, if you truly, now in Idaho, we have a dormant season. It stops growing, and there is months where nothing grows. So it's a much more defined thing there. But the last inventory tells you what do you have to work with. We actually continued to do inventories through the winter. And you say, why are you doing inventories? It's not growing. Because it's disappearing. It disappears in 2 ways for us. One is weathering. The weathering does break down that standing forage to a certain degree. The other place it goes is elk, deer, antelope. We feed a ton of wildlife every winter. And so I figured out how much feed does the wildlife take from us every month, how much weathers down every month. And so we got to where we can very accurately predict how many days of feed we're going to have, when we're going to have to start feeding. And we can make a choice. All right, so I got typically 400 some cows up there. And if I were going to graze all winter, I could say, okay, I can get to March 27th. If I keep this number of cows and I've got this much feed. Well, I got a choice. I could sell down to 300 cows, or we can bring in feed. Sometimes it makes more sense to sell 100 cows. Sometimes it makes more sense to buy 1,000 tons of hay. Depends on where we are in the markets. But the key point is you have to know what your feed supply is. You have to know what your expected demand is. And if you know those 2 things, you can make sound business decisions about which way you're going to go. Are you going to reduce numbers, or are you going to increase feed supply? Here's some key points. We stockpile pasture. I don't like thinking about this is a calf pasture, this is a cow pasture, this is the sheep pasture. No pasture has to be allocated out that way as an all or nothing deal. Here's why. Every pasture, even in a stockpiled pasture, there's some finishing quality feed there. It might only be 5%. There's some growing quality feed there, and there's maintenance quality feed. Depending on what you have stockpiled, how you're managing it dictates what that stratification is. And so we look at our pastures not only with how much feed is standing there, but what is the relative nutritive value of that feed for the different classes of livestock we might be wanting to overwinter. When we figure that out, rather than taking a stack of stockpiled fescue that's that deep and with one class of animals graze it down to this point, we do leader-follower grazings. We do sequential grazings. And it's very important that you only ask the weaned calves to eat that portion of the stockpile that is adequate feed for a weaned calf. Like I said, it might only be 5%. Another field it's 20%. This is why we call it management-intensive grazing, because it's about intensifying management, not intensifying grazing. And then a key one, underestimate your supply, overestimate your demand. If you do that, you build a margin of safety in there. The opposite is the worst thing that you can do. Overestimate your supply, underestimate your demand. So we want to think about the worst possible winter scenario, the highest demand that we might experience. And if we go out there and say, oh, I've got 100 AUDs per acre stockpiled out there, plan it based on 75. And you'll get through the winter much more safely. All right, when you know what that supply is, now we have to start thinking about how are we going to balance our livestock demand against that supply that we have. Another key concept, one of the things I figured out in Missouri that helped us get to that point of make no hay, feed no hay, is this. Carrying capacity is not constant year-round. Plants don't grow at the same rate every day of the year. You're always going to have a time of abundance. You're always going to have a time of deficit, which means your stocking rate should be flexible. You should put yourself into a position where you are adjusting the animal's demand. Now, there's other ways of doing that by simply changing the number of animals, and we'll see what that is in a minute. I already had said this morning. Key thing was when I figured out to run our cow herd based on our winter grazing supply, not summer grazing supply, that's what put us into the position of being able to comfortably graze through the winter. Greg Hellich this morning, he started with those 20 cows. He had 20 individual cows on there, and he cut a row off, and then he cut another row off. We did not actually reduce our cow number. We did some other things. We changed our calving season, which was a key thing, and I'm going to come back to that here in a little bit also. We changed our calving season to reflect when the forage supply was there. We changed the nature of our pastures to a certain degree. So we have to have flexibility in the stocking rate. This morning I said we did that by going into the custom grazing business. And a lot of people's idea of custom grazing is we're going to have these stockers on our place for 5, 6, 7 months. Stockers will make 80 to 90% of the gain they're going to make over the course of an entire growing season in the first 90 days on pasture. If they make 85% of their gain in 90 days, why on earth would you want to keep them another 90 days to only get 15% of the gain potential? You make your money early, you lose it late if you do that. So we had to develop a custom grazing enterprise that allowed us to bring animals onto the place for only 90 days and have people be happy. And the enterprise that we ended up doing that worked out perfectly for us was custom grazing dry fall calving cows for southern Iowa corn farmers. Because they wanted the cows off of their place when corn planting season started. So they wanted to ship them out in April. That's when we needed to get them. They all calved starting in late August, 1st of September, because they wanted to have their pairs on stock fields. So they wanted them home by the middle of August because you don't want to have calves coming on the trucks. So that was the enterprise that fit our needs perfectly, was a dry fall calving cow. Plus, that was paid by the head day, not by the rate of gain. So we knew exactly what the paycheck was going to be the day we negotiated the contract. We got half of the money the day the cows arrived, half of the money the day the cows left. That's 2 paychecks, which for if you're primarily a cow-calf operator and your big paycheck is when you sell calves, getting those other 2 paychecks in the year is a good deal. So stock policy is the livestock type and number present on the ranch at any time. And here's where we need to think about classes of livestock and what their energy needs are. Because in the green growing season, you have high energy forage typically. In the dormant season, you have low energy forage. You do not want high energy demanding animals. Okay, I thought some. So most of these presentations that I have are actually narrated auto run. And every once in a while, sometimes I realize I forgot to turn off the auto run on there, and someone will start talking behind me, and it's me. But in this case, it wasn't me. Okay, so we have classes of animals that we would say are very high energy demand. What is very high energy demand? That is when we have a TDN requirement in excess of about 65 to 67%. Lactating dairy cows and nannies, using nannies nursing twins and triplets, grass-finished beef, pasture-fed finished beef, gaining better than 2 1/4 pounds a day. That takes energy. You have to have really high TDN to accomplish that performance. Unless you are growing cool season annual forages, you are not going to have that quality of feed in December, January, February. With annuals in some environments effectively managed, you can have that. Most places you don't. High energy. This would be early to mid lactation beef cows, fattening lambs on pasture, growing stockers, say from 1 3/4 to 2 1/4 pounds a day. That takes high energy. Where's that? That's your TDNs from about 60 to 65. Moderate lactation, late lactation beef cows, replacement heifers, stockers, pound and a half. This is your 54 to 59% TDNs. And we can have that in stockpiled tall fescue. I forget who mentioned it, but I think it was you, Chris. Did you say something about having 60% TDN in stockpiled fescue? We've measured that type of quality there. In Missouri, we ran fall calving cows through the entire winter, no supplementation other than salt and mineral on stockpiled pastures. You grow the stockpile right, and it will do the job. Then we have low energy, dry pregnant adults, and roughing those calves through the winter. Because mostly, if we're looking at average stockpiled fescue pastures, this is what we have. And so you want to have mostly dry, if you're spring calving, you want dry cows going through the winter on this stockpiled feed. If you're doing the fall calving cows, you manage the stockpile, and I'll talk about how to grow good stockpile a little bit later on. You manage that stockpile to ensure that you have the nutritional value that will support a fall calving cow. It's certainly doable. Birthing season, then this comes into play. And Dr. Jones this morning talked a bit about fall calving and how well it fits the fescue endophyte toxicity pattern and the growth habit of fescue. Man, I concur with that. The research station in Missouri back in the 1970s did research on both fall calving cows and spring calving cows. They quit doing research on fall calving cows and focused on spring calving cows, not because fall calving didn't work, but because it worked so well. Basically, there were no issues, there was no problem, there was no research question about fall calving cows on fescue. It worked. And so they went from the mid-70s to the mid-1990s with no fall calving cows there, only spring calving cows. And then in the mid-90s, we resumed work with fall calving cows because we had gotten so much better at growing stockpiled pasture, we thought it would be even better. If I had stayed in Missouri, I would have moved my personal herd to a fall calving herd, and I would have gone from our 45-day calving season to a 30-day calving season. That is how well adapted, environmentally adapted, and forage adapted cows will work. In our 45-day calving season, fall calving cows, we usually had 90% of the calves on the ground in the first cycle. If you can do that, why leave the bulls out there for another cycle? 30-day calving season? You talk about a life of luxury, absolutely. All right, so some things to think about. Cows, they're going to come to peak lactation in 45 to 60 days. The cow has to get bred on day 83 to maintain a 12-month calving cycle. So if you think about what your forage supply is, and again, Dr. Jones, he mentioned the term calve in sync with nature. Out west, I'm totally about calving in sync with nature. In the broader sense, I say calve in sync with your forage supply. And if your forage supply is endo-phyte-infected tall fescue, I think that means fall calving. If you're in East Texas and annual ryegrass in February and March is the highest quality forage you're going to have all year, calving in January makes perfect sense. The weather's not bad, the feed supply is magnificent, coming to peak lactation and breeding, and it works. It's not in sync with nature at all. It's in sync with the forage supply. Sheep come to peak lactation much faster, and it's a shorter peak. But in either of these cases, here's what matters. Because your highest energy demand of the whole year is when these females are at peak lactation, and if you want to raise them cost effectively, you have that peak coincide with your best forage of the season. Now in Missouri, we calved our cows April 15th to the end of May, which meant we bred cows late July and August, and we did fantastic. You know why? Because I had red-hided cows with Brahman genetics in them. Everything we ran were Barzona cross cows. And they did not need shade. They bred in the heat of the summer. Fescue didn't really bother them. It was great. Did research at the university station with black-hided cows and black-hided bulls. Tried to do the same calving season and breeding with them, and it was a complete and total wreck. Environmental adaptation, forage adaptation. That drives part of when you're going to do this calving. All right, here's what we don't want to do, is calve in the snow, lamb in the snow, because all of that additional energy demand that comes from lactation has to be supplied by stored forage. Now, you can have cows calving in the snow like that, and you can have stockpiled pasture standing in the field, but it's not going to be good enough for them because they're on that rising demand of increasing lactation, increasing energy, and the stockpile is in its declining quality phase. If you're going to graze cows all winter, either you want them to be true spring calving cows, calving on green grass, or you want them to be fall calving cows so that as winter is progressing, they're already bred, they're past peak lactation, and if the quality and quantity of the stockpile is going down, that's okay because their demand, their requirements are going down. They can still milk and support a calf, and when that green grass comes, that calf is going to explode. with compensatory gain because it didn't go through the winter, at truly high rate of gain that we see on spring calving cows. Okay, next thing is we have to have forage in the field. Stockpiling. It's accumulating forage in the growing season to use later. Chris talked about doing that as a summer stockpile. Yeah, you can do that. We can winter stockpile. It just means growing it one time, using it later. You can stockpile anything. It's just some stuff's a whole lot better than others. Timothy seed heads there. Timothy is not a good stockpiling grass. What is? Tall fescue. Some of you have heard me say this before. What are the 5 best reasons for growing tall fescue? November, December, January, February, and March. That's your 5 best reasons for growing tall fescue. You don't grow meadow brome grass here. We do in the West, and it's almost as good as tall fescue for winter grazing. And then from there, the list goes down and goes down fast. I very often say that I can take a trained cow behind an electric fence and make her eat anything except reed canary grass. That's my one point of total failure. Absolutely. It's completely useless in the winter in my experience. They will not eat it. Everything else gets by it. So what makes fescue so good? It grows. In the fall of the year, it grows. And especially if it rains, does it grow. I remember when I was in grad school at UK, and I was Chuck Doherty's first American graduate student. And we did a stockpiling project, and I remember measuring yields on stockpiled fescue of 5 tons to the acre. That's feed all grown after early August. It happened to rain that year. Fescue has some of its best nutritive value of the year in the fall. Weather resistant, freeze thaw, freeze thaw, freeze thaw. Orchard grass turns to mush. The leaves fall off of Timothy. Fescue just gets better. And it's the next best thing to concrete when it comes to muddy times. Now, this has been touched on a little bit. This is work we did in Missouri, and we're looking at the crude protein content of stockpiled fescue through the winter. The green bars are controlled grazing. The yellow bars are set stock or continuous grazing. So the idea of stockpiling and grazing fescue through the winter is not a new idea. There was research done, University of Kentucky, University of Missouri, Virginia Polytech, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It wasn't a new idea, but there was a lot of reports that said there is a steady decline in forage quality through the winter on stockpiled feed. With set stocking, there is. You know why? What's the second line on that cow's position description? Find the best bite of feed that you can. And almost all of that work in the 50s, 60s, 70s was done either just set stocking or very slow rotations. And so the cow had the opportunity to go in the field and pick out all the highest quality material. And so each week that goes by, the forage availability, because they've eaten some, is going down, but the quality of that forage is going down even faster because of the selective grazing. So the controlled grazing done here, each of these 15-day periods is 5 3-day strip grazes. So these cattle are moving to fresh pasture every 3 days. We are protecting January's forage, February's forage from selective grazing. It is not until we get past the first of the year that we actually see any kind of significant drop in the forage quality that's actually due to winter weather. The perception that stockpiled feed always, is declining steadily over the winter was based actually on how it was being grazed. If you allow the animals to take all the high quality out, that's what they're going to do. So strip grazing protects that forage supply later into the winter. So I've talked about grow the stockpile right to have better quality in it. And this is one of the key things here. And we did research with this in Missouri while I was there. Similar stuff had been done. But if we have a pasture that we've grazed down and then we start it to grow, what we find is to go from the point of being either clipped down or grazed down to getting the maximum yield that we can produce on stockpile takes about 60 to 75 days of that late summer and fall growing conditions. So if we say the end of our growing season is November 1st, we're going to back up 60 to 75 days from that, and that's going to put us in the window of August 15th to September 1st. That's when you start growing the stockpile, if your objective is maximum yield. If you are grazing dry, pregnant, spring calving cows, that's what you want. It's maximum yield because the forage quality is going to be good enough. If you start that stockpiling, though, the 1st of August or July 15th, you will not end up with any more feed. You will end up with the same amount of feed, but much lower quality feed. Jerry Matches at Missouri did that work, and I don't know, Gary, were you involved in that study when you were there? Yeah. So Gary's been around a while, and he was involved in some of that research back in the 1970s, and that's why I say it's not a new idea. What we've done over the last 20 to 30 years is refined how to grow a higher quality stockpile. We can shorten that recovery period. I mean, if we want to run lactating fall calving cows on it, if we want to wean calves on it and continue to grow wean calves through the winter on stockpiled pasture, we shorten up the recovery period and you go into winter with a higher quality feed. That stand condition, we like starting our stockpile from a 3 to 5 inch residual. If you got a bunch of dead clumps of summer accumulated uneaten fescue out there and you leave that out there, guess what? You just go into the winter with clumps of crap. You get a little bit of new growth, but mostly you're going in with lousy feed. You're not going to get good performance on that. The shorter stubble you start from, the higher the quality the stockpile is going to be. Now this says irrigation management. It's rain. Where we are, it's irrigation. But water is important, and the important time to have that water is in August and September. And in Missouri, what we measured for yield response, and we see exactly the same thing in Idaho, for every inch of water that we get in August and September, potentially we can grow 300 to 500 pounds more stockpiled forage per acre. Water makes grass grow. And then we have nitrogen availability. Once heard the definition of an agronomist as someone who never ceases to be amazed that nitrogen makes grass grow. Where do we get nitrogen? Legumes in the mix, applied manures, commercial fertilizer. Again, work we did in Missouri, looking at stockpiling, fescue with and without nitrogen, and various fescue legume mixtures with and without nitrogen. So the listing is here. The dark blue bar has 60 pounds of nitrogen applied. The medium blue bar has no nitrogen applied. And you say, wow, that's pretty impressive that you have that kind of yield with no legume. Well, red clover grows like a weed in North Missouri. And there's a lot of local seed production. And the fields have been sprayed so many times with 2,4-D to kill thistles that we basically have 2,4-D resistant red clover. And these plots were sprayed not once but twice with 2,4-D to try to eradicate the red clover out of there so that we could actually have a treatment that had no legume in it. And guess what? We still had 30% red clover in those sprayed pastures. So we have all these different legumes listed here, but everything is underlain and masked by that presence of red clover. So when you talk about fertilizing stockpiled pasture with nitrogen to grow more. If you have a strong legume component in there, that 60 pounds of nitrogen, you can't say, oh, that gave us 2 tons per acre yield because we put 60 pounds of nitrogen on. We were getting 3,000 with no nitrogen, just the legume there. So no, you didn't get 2 tons. You got that extra 700 to 1,000 pounds in response to that 60 units of nitrogen. And if you, okay, in the actual stockpile phase, it's almost always 70 to 80% of it is grass. The benefit, what you're seeing there as the benefit, you know, red clover is wanting to go into dormancy in fall, so we're not growing a whole lot of it in the stockpile, but it's fixed nitrogen all summer long. And what you are seeing is a nitrogen response, but that nitrogen has come from the legume constituent there. Okay, and that's kind of where I am. If 30 to 50% of your summer production is coming from the legume component, you're going to grow good stockpile, and it will not respond to nitrogen fertilization. So we can stockpile perennial pastures, we can grow annuals. Winter annuals, what can they do? They extend the growing season later into the fall, and they start earlier in the spring. So it gives you a benefit on both ends of winter. And then we emphasize the quality of the feed. A nice set of winter annuals out there, properly grown, that can be finishing quality feed. It's dairy quality feed, you know, until it freezes down and melts away. But when we were grazing annual ryegrass in North Missouri, which is a long ways further north than, you know, what northern Kentucky here is, we only had about a 30 or 35 day gap from when, you know, we could graze it to late January, 1st of February, then it wouldn't be doing anything and the feed quality wouldn't be there. But by the 10th of March, 15th of March, it was coming back and restarting again. So it was a pretty small window of time that we could not use our annuals there. Mostly we're talking about the cereal grains, and then we have annual ryegrass there. Annual ryegrass is one of the most fabulous plants on the planet when it comes to animal nutrition. And what we really liked was a mixture of oats and ryegrass, because the oats would come up faster in the fall, give us good feed then, but it wouldn't survive the winter. And then the ryegrass was a little slower to come in the fall, but then it was explosive in the spring. And sometimes we grew it with brassicas and sometimes not. Hairy vetch, we commonly would grow hairy vetch with it. We have choices of winter annual legumes. Most of these winter annual legumes do not give you very much feed on the front side of winter. They're not contributing nitrogen to the production of your ryegrass or oats in the fall, but they make a good yield in the spring. They fix nitrogen, and that nitrogen that they fix is actually mostly beneficial to the subsequent crop, whether that's a warm season annual following it or the perennial grass coming back in there. Then we have the brassicas, and these are great shoulder season crops. They can come on very fast, give you a good supply of feed. I think we have measured over 2.5 tons per acre at 45 days after seeding on turnips and the forage Brassica from New Zealand. So good feed. They come fast, fill in spaces. Now I want to talk about summer annuals and say, well, I thought you were talking about winter grazing. I am talking about winter grazing. Out on the plains, one of the biggest things being used right now for winter grazing, and in southern Canada, things being used for winter grazing are summer annual forages, because you can grow a massive yield in the summer months, and you have a couple of choices in the West. Here, you pretty well have to leave it standing and you graze the standing crop. In the West, we have the opportunity to do what's called swath grazing, where you mow it, put it into windrows, and because it never rains in the late summer or fall for us, we can have stuff in a windrow for 6 months. Be grazing stuff we cut in September, and we'll graze it in March out of windrows. And you go and you open those up, and they're green and fresh, smell like, new mown hay. It's amazing. Swath grazing is. But it doesn't work here because it does rain in the fall, and it'll just rot there. But summer annuals, productive in midsummer and high quality. Again, dairy quality, finishing quality feed in the middle of summer when your perennials typically aren't doing it. But we can stockpile them and take them into the winter. In the active growing season, good for any class of livestock. As we get late in the season, digestibility has gone down, and so the performance value has gone down. We can have summer annuals, still with quite a bit of green in fall, but the animal performance just isn't there because the energy content's gone down. What are summer annual grasses? Top of the list there's corn. Corn is just a great big summer annual grass. And then crabgrass after that. Crabgrass to me is a fabulous forage, both during active growing season. It's one of the few grasses that will, warm seasons, that'll support 2 pound a day average daily gain on steers going through summer. But also as one of the weedy grasses, stockpiled, gives very good performance on dry cows in the wintertime. And say it's just a big summer annual grass. You can graze it green for good performance, growing stock in the summer. You can leave it standing for cow feed, stocker feed, not grass-fed beef, but corn-finished beef. I don't remember who it was, and Gary, you probably know. When I was in grad school, we took a tour out to some farmer's place who for years had been finishing cattle on standing corn. Yeah, Holtzclaws. Yeah. Again, 40 years ago, grazing corn there. The way you can get some double duty out of the land is flying cool season annuals. Ryegrass, turnips, oats is a real common mixture. Flown onto corn. Ed Ballard is the guy who first, showed me that in Illinois, as Ed here, as a practice, again, probably 30 years ago. And I think that might even be your photo. Does that look familiar to you? Yeah, that's an Ed Ballard picture right there. So rather than just having stalks out there, which is more of a cow feed, you put the annuals with it, and that acre of cropland is giving you another whole crop of high-quality feed. There's some warm season, summer legumes. One of the things that some people get in trouble with is they don't recognize how rapidly the summer annuals can take off and grow, and they get to something like that. You don't get a lot of grazing efficiency there. So this is the appropriate point on these summer cocktail mixes. And when people ask me, well, how should I be grazing that? I just say hip to knees, hip to knees. You don't want to get it any higher than your hip, and you basically don't want to graze it much lower than your knees. If you just work in that zone there, you can get a lot of production and a lot of performance out of it. A lot of people are growing these cover crops in no-till farming systems for building soil quality, building organic matter back into it. And so this is where we have to think that what we leave behind is just as important as what we're taking off, or it's even more important. And so if you're growing a cover crop and you're a farmer and you're trying to build organic matter in a wet environment like Kentucky, Indiana, we actually want to make sure we're leaving at least a ton of dry matter on that field for soil building purposes. In the Western Plains, we're looking at 1,000 pounds. But remember, if your goal is to build soil, you got to leave something there to build that soil with. Tillage, I'm not a fan of tillage. It's expensive financially and biologically. That, I did that thing too. Tillage, kill soil life. It's expensive. Then we also get the after effects of erosion. So if you are doing annuals, whether it's winter or summer, I almost always want to do it no-till. This was putting the oats ryegrass turnip mixture into grazed crabgrass at Linnaeus, Missouri. And that's the way we like to do it. We like to keep that ground covered. Just a few quick things on no-till. Seeding, timeliness is essential. A lot of people say, well, I'm not going to drill until it rains because I don't want to waste my seed. And then it rains and it gets too wet to get in the field, and it rains again, and suddenly you miss the window of opportunity. My view is I believe that it's going to rain. I'm going to have faith that it's going to rain. We're going to put that seed into the soil on the appropriate day that it needs to go there and count on it to rain. And I would say 4 out of 5 times when we've done that, it has been a success. If we wait and say, let's wait till it rains, I'd say we're no better than 50-50 in getting a stand going that way. Last thing we have here is controlled grazing. Greg talked about that. Will has talked about that. Other people. But the key thing is, how will animals graze this pasture? It depends. If you set stock, they will select what they like. The good plants will disappear, low digestibility stems are left behind, and when you get to that point, unless you supplement, feed them, they're going to lose condition, not perform, die, all those bad outcomes we don't want to happen. This is not our place, this is over in Montana, one of our client ranches, but that's a 2,400 acre pasture. And first year I worked with them, they put 400 cows out there. And so the question is, okay, what's she going to eat? She can go anywhere she wants in that 2,400 acres and high grade out the protein, and that's what they do. So the real question is, what's she going to do on the 100th day of winter? And she's not going to have enough to eat. But again, if we do controlled grazing, we can budget out that protein. We have clients in the West who have completely eliminated their protein supplementation programs because they changed the way that they graze that dormant rangeland. Are you okay? There was supposed to be a deal. So it's one of the studies we did in Missouri where we compared 2-week feed allocations to 3-day feed allocations. 4-year study. We ended up getting 40% more grazing days per acre from the 3-day allocation compared to 2 weeks. And that was an early study. As time went by, we got to where we easily doubled and 250%. I don't know that we ever tripled our grazed stockpiled feed, but we more than doubled it, and 250% increases. Controlled grazing is one of the keys to making it work. We're going to skip that. We've already seen that. So the shorter the grazing period, less opportunity for selective grazing. They eat the good, the bad, and ugly all together. We're going to skip this. Okay, so this is what strip grazing, and that's my front porch view. This is what strip grazing does for us. It preserves that winter feed supply through the winter. The animals aren't walking through it, stomping it, tramping it, breaking it. It preserves feed quality because they can't go through and high grade out the best material. If you have more feed and better feed through the winter, animal performance is going to improve, and that's what we're looking for. So, summing it up, know your seasonal forage supply and nutritive value. Balance that supply and demand by adjusting your stocking rate, your timing of calving, the type of animals you have there. Look at your different options. The more feed options that you have, the greater flexibility you're going to have. So use some annuals, stockpile some perennials, get the native warm season grasses into the overall program so you have a window of time in late summer when you come off of the fescue pasture so you can stockpile it. Use controlled grazing, and then you need to have a positive attitude. Has Henry Ford and many other people have said, if you don't believe that'll work, it won't. And there's, again, I guess I wouldn't have forgotten to say about the quality pasture because there's a book ad there. Questions, comments? Yes, sir. They do. The forage brassica. I mean, there's kale, there's rape, there's swedes. I have never used swedes myself. It's my understanding, because they use them a lot more in Canada, that the swedes are much more freeze resistant than are turnips. The forage brassicas, they have been working on cold hardiness on those, and I know there's varieties now that can take several hard freezes and still maintain some leaf integrity, and if it warms back up, they'll kick back into growing mode. So there are options. Barenberg, we get some of our forage brassicas through them. They've got some good varieties that are getting better and better for winter use. So talk to them. Others? Yeah.
How many pounds are you figuring for your cow day? For those of us who don't make a day.
Okay. All right. What do we figure as a cow? Standard animal unit is 26 pounds of dry matter forage consumed. Now, when we're figuring animal units, we just take total herd weight, divide it by 1,000. No, that's not metabolically perfect, but it's close enough on the ranch. That's how we do it. But 26 pounds dry matter forage is a standard animal unit day. Did you have something, Gordon?
Yeah, you talk about oats. You talk about black oats. Talk about what oats do you do.
Okay. Okay. So Dr. Jones asked me to talk about black oats. I know about as much about black oats as you do. Now this might sound a little funny to some of you, but my wife, who handles our forage seed business, she knows way more about particular varieties and species and things. And I know in some of their mixtures in some parts of the country, she uses black oats rather than oats. And I have to tell you, I don't know why. I don't know what the difference is. But there's intelligent people around who could probably answer that question. One last question, then we got to stop because I'm over. Yes, sir. Okay. He asked, what do we do for windbreaks when we're out in the middle of nowhere? It's called a hide. That's what we do for windbreaks. It's a hide. Yeah. Now, if you got a little bit of roll in the landscape, they will shelter up. In Missouri, we had enough rolling land. I mean, the wind was uncomfortable a lot of times, but the cattle, if they needed to, they could get in the lee of a hill or, behind some brush or something. But I never deliberately worried about windbreaks. In the mountain valleys where we are, the wind is not a real factor. You get out on what we call the Snake River Plain, which is fat Idaho down at the bottom, where the wind just blows steadily and nastily. People will do windbreak there, but winter haircoat and a hide is what I think a windbreak is. Cruel and unusual, I know. Ray?
Thank you, Jim.